All right, let's dive right into this explainer. I want you to imagine a structure that completely defies the technological limits of its time. We are talking about a massive 30-meter high temple built 3,000 years ago. Think about that. No electricity, no cranes, literally zero modern machinery, just human hands, unmatched ambition, and frankly, mind-boggling ancient engineering. Today, we're unpacking the impossible logistics behind the Grand Temple of Solomon. It's an absolute marvel of the ancient world, and as you'll see, the sheer scale of it is just wild.
To really wrap our heads around the scale we're dealing with, let's start at the very bottom. When experts examined the foundation stones at the site where the temple was built, they discovered something absolutely staggering. The massive foundation stones weighed up to 400 tons each. Just to visualize that for a second, 400 tons is the equivalent weight of 60 large elephants for a single block of stone.
So that brings us to the ultimate question, right? How on earth was this moved without a single machine? How did these ancient engineers manage a feat that would literally make modern construction crews break a sweat, using nothing but human hands? Well, the answer is as brutal as it is brilliant.
Section 1. Moving mountains of stone.
Because, before you can even think about moving a 400-ton block, you have to survive the grueling reality of cutting it out of the earth in the first place. And they didn't have dynamite, so how do you make a perfect cut? The ingenuity here is just incredible. They used this remarkably clever, completely explosive-free ancient technology. First, they draw their lines using stones that were actually harder than the limestone they were cutting. Then they drilled small, deep holes right along those lines. Next, and this is the genius part, they inserted bone-dry wooden pegs into the holes and poured water over them. The wood would absorb the water, slowly swell up, and that immense steady pressure would crack the massive stone perfectly along the intended line.
But who was actually doing all this back-breaking work? Well, there was a really harsh labor divide. The Israeli workers operated on a rotation. They do 1 month in the quarries, then take 2 months off at home, and they were compensated with provisions, things like food and oil. On the flip side, the Canaanite laborers were subjected to relentless forced labor. We're talking no breaks, no rotation, and severe punishment if they failed. They basically worked until they dropped.
Okay, so once cut, these massive stones had to be moved, and this took 70,000 men whose sole job was just hauling. They built these highly compacted dirt ramps up and down the mountains. They placed the 400-ton stones on wooden rollers and tied them up with thick ropes made entirely out of plants. It was terrifyingly slow. Sometimes it took weeks to move a stone just 5 kilometers. And it was incredibly lethal. I mean, think about it. If those plant-based ropes snapped under all that immense tension, the enormous stone would just slide backward, crushing absolutely anyone caught in its path.
Section 2. The deadly cedar journey.
Moving stone was really just the beginning, because securing the temple's prized wood was a whole other massive logistical nightmare. Israel didn't exactly have these massive trees laying around, so King Solomon had to negotiate with King Hiram of Tyre to get them. And the annual cost? Astronomical. He paid 20,000 cores of wheat, which is over 4 million liters, and 20,000 baths of pressed oil, which is around 2 million liters. It was this incredibly expensive, massive trade deal just to secure that fragrant, rot-resistant cedar wood.
Under the management of a supervisor named Adoniram, actually transporting this wood was a brutal 2-part journey. First, they tied these massive logs into giant rafts and literally floated them down the Mediterranean Sea to the port of Joppa, battling storms and snapped ropes the whole way. Then came the truly hard part, dragging each ton-heavy log 60 kilometers over dry land all the way to Jerusalem, using those exact same dangerous rollers and ropes they used for the stones.
Section 3. The rule of silence. Now, I want us to take a collective breath here, because we're about to introduce what is easily the most mind-boggling constraint of this entire megastructure project. Once the materials finally reached the construction site at Mount Moriah, there was an absolute unbreakable rule: 0 iron, 0 noise. The site had to remain completely, utterly silent. This wasn't just some loose guideline. It was a divine decree. As recorded in 1 Kings 6:7, no hammer, chisel, or any other iron tool was heard at the temple's site while it was being built. Because this was viewed as a highly sacred space, the home of God, the construction had to be conducted in utter peace and reverence. But let's think about the engineering reality of this for a second. It meant every single piece of this massive puzzle had to be millimeter perfect before it ever arrived at the site.
So how on earth did they do it without hammering things into place on site? Well, they used an absolutely brilliant off-site preparation system. Everything, and I mean everything, was cut to millimeter perfection back in the noisy quarry. The architects used a system of Hebrew letters and symbols as marker codes on the stones. When a 400-ton stone arrived at the Temple Mount, the workers read the code and slotted it perfectly into place. It had to be an instant perfect fit. And get this, if a stone was off by even a fraction of an inch, they couldn't just chisel it down. No way. They had to haul it all the way back. And the punishments for those kinds of errors, let's just say they were incredibly severe.
Section 4. Forging in pure gold.
Let's shift our focus from silent stone to the intense heat and astonishing wealth of the Holy of Holies. The economic scale of this project is honestly hard to even fathom. Solomon's annual gold intake was 660 talents. That is over 22 tons of solid gold every single year, and a massive chunk of that went straight into this temple. The entire interior of the Holy of Holies was completely lined with 27 tons of pure gold. But gold doesn't just magically stick to walls, right? Think about the brutal, sweaty work the artisans had to do. They operated constantly burning furnaces to soften the gold. Working in that suffocating heat, they carefully hammered the pure gold into paper-thin plates. Then those plates were meticulously nailed over the intricate carvings of the cedarwood walls, and they polished it all until it gleamed like a mirror.
To manage this insane level of detail, Solomon brought in an absolute genius, a Phoenician master craftsman named Hurrem-Abi from Tyre, because frankly, no one in Israel had his metalworking skills. Look at what this guy created. Massive 4.5-meter-high cherubim with wings stretching across the room, completely covered in gold. 2 towering 8-meter-tall bronze pillars named Jachin and Boaz, and this massive bronze basin called the Sea, resting on the backs of 12 cast bronze bulls. It was quite simply a masterpiece of ancient art and engineering.
Which brings us to our final section, Section 5, a divine masterpiece completed.
Bringing these chaotic, incredibly massive elements together required flawless management. The sheer scale of the workforce alone is staggering, 150,000 men. But remember, this wasn't some disorganized mob. It was perfectly orchestrated by 3,300 supervisors and 550 chief officers. They managed everything like a well-oiled military machine, dealing out rations for good work and strict punishments for failure or delay.
And here is the craziest part. Despite the insane logistical hurdles, the deadly conditions, the literal mountains of stone, and that incredibly strict rule of silence, the project was finished precisely on its promised deadline. It took exactly 7 years and 255 days, officially wrapping up in the 11th year of Solomon's reign.
The culmination of all this blood, sweat, and gold occurred during the Festival of Tabernacles. When the sacred ark was finally brought inside, the biblical account describes a truly awe-inspiring event. The priests could not perform their service, for the glory of the Lord filled his temple. A dense, divine cloud of glory completely filled the completed structure. All those years of unimaginable labor had finally become exactly what they set out to build, the dwelling place of God.
And the celebration that followed? Well, it was on a scale that entirely matched the construction. To dedicate this megastructure, Solomon offered an unprecedented sacrifice: 22,000 bulls and 120,000 sheep. It was a staggering display of immense wealth, proving the absolute significance of achieving this incredible dream for the nation. So, we've seen the 400-ton stones moved entirely by hand. We've traced the deadly logistics of the cedar transport, the absolute zero-noise precision on site, and the thousands of tons of gold. Which really leaves us with this final thought. Looking at the sheer scale, the incredible manual labor, and the absolute perfection required in utter silence, could humanity ever pull off a feat of this precision with those exact same limitations ever again? It's definitely something to think about. Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and we'll catch you next time.